Joining us today by phone from Toronto is Greg Renouf. I'm going to introduce you as somebody who is a radical watcher. You're an independent journalist. You've got a blog that you've been writing now for many years, genuinewitty.com.
I know a lot of people personally involved in these movements from my being involved in Occupy. And the average person who is out there protesting believes they're protesting for climate change. And they believe they're doing the right thing and a good thing. The leaders of the protests, on the other hand, they're more involved, right? Most of them, you look at they're involved with socialist, revolutionary focused groups, and they're not there to help the First Nations necessarily. They're there to help their movement. And the First Nations offer them opportunities of stirring things up. A few years ago, I wrote a story of the 5 things every journalist needs to know about the Unistoten camp, and one of the main ones is the camp isn't all that indigenous. Here's a quote from one of the hereditary chiefs. He wrote, "We have lots of folks from all over the world here at the camp every day. We hardly see any of our own people here. This is a great place to make new friends. There's a camp coming up in May," this is a few years ago, "and a whole lot of volunteers coming from around the world. Why don't you come up?" So even the people who were running the camp, this was in 2014, admitted that there weren't that many First Nations people involved in the camp. And so they're taking First Nations issues and they're taking the sore and ripping the scab off of it and creating a lot of damage inside of societies from what I've seen.
And how do they position themselves there? Like how do they get themselves into that position?
From what I've seen, generally what happens is most of these activists, a lot of these activists are in the cities, are involved in the poverty industry. So in the downtown east side of Vancouver, there will be people coming down there who are First Nations who are recruited then, and later on they come back up to their nation with them. So they have these poor people who are suffering and through poverty and having very, very little to look forward to. They pick them up, they radicalize them, and they then take them home and they stir up trouble like they are right now. But I guess it goes back to one of my pet peeves with the media. When I started following this First Nations conflicts, I keep on reading articles in the CBC that First Nations oppose pipeline. The average person, and me included, for years I'd read those articles, First Nations against the pipeline, and I would just think, okay, well then First Nations people don't like pipelines, right? But a whole lot of First Nations people do like pipelines. And they want to have, particularly in the gas pipeline case of the Coastal Gas pipeline, is they've got every band council accepting it, and they have interviews on the street of people who want it because it's getting them jobs. All indications are the majority of people in the Wet'suwet'en community want this pipeline, but these activists are trying to stop them by bringing in these 5 chiefs. 5 out of 12 or 13, I believe, but not a majority. Kind of like saying that there's 5 kings who should be making the decision. But the voices we haven't been hearing.
Greg, one second. I just want to make sure that, and I think you can see this footage. I'm just rolling a little bit right now of some close-up shots of some of the people that have been at the protests, and they're not particularly indigenous.
No, neither was the Unistoten camp when it started up for the Wet'suwet'en protests. And to their own words, not many of their own people were there. I would say from my observations the last 8-9 years, most of these First Nations protests are maybe 5 or 6 people at the front of the protest and then a bunch of white people behind them. It's not just like that with First Nations protests. Take the Black Lives Matters protest in Toronto. They had a big rally at the Toronto police station, and it was a sea of white people with like 10 black people up front. They're grabbing on to people through their identity and using identity politics to leverage things. But in reality, they don't have that many people from the identity they're trying to leverage that are involved. And if you look at the real power behind most of these protests, it's career activists who most of them are not First Nation. All these non-native protesters, if you look at their backgrounds and their history, it goes back to the anti-globalization movement. and the Battle of Seattle in Seattle when they had the WTO there in 1999, when people had their first black bloc incident, where people would dress up in black masks and run down through the street and smash windows and things. That was the birth of this movement here that's going on. That moved on to Quebec City, where they had the Summit of the Americas protests, where we had similar black bloc actions. The most active of all the NGOs up there has been the Council of Canadians, which is an environmental labor allied organization led by Mark Barlow. There's a militancy in these protesters, and they're based. If I was to really water them down, they're smash the state activists. They're the people who, during the 2010 Olympics, they were smashing up the streets in Vancouver. During the G20 in Toronto in 2010, they were smashing up the streets in Toronto. They're looking for fights. And the Council of Canadians is very central to those fights. And they're funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And the Council of Canadians was involved in funding and building the Healing Center up at the Wet'suwet'en. We have the Ruckus Society up there at the Wet'suwet'en, which is an American group funded by Rockefeller and Tides and many of the other NGOs funding anti-environmental activism here in Canada.
So I've got their website up there right now, Greg, for everyone to see. Their tagline is "Power concedes nothing without a demand, and never has, and it never will."
The Ruckus Society was one of the fundamental organizations behind the violence of the World Trade Organization in Seattle, what they call the Battle of Seattle. They're based out of Oakland, California, which is the center of the American militant anarchist movement. If you were to use a word for them, some people use communist or socialist or Marxist.
So let's jump to the next as we move along here. The Indigenous Environmental Network.
Indigenous Environmental Network is another NGO that's funded by Tides and Rockefeller Brothers and other U.S. funds. They were very involved in starting up the camp at the Minnesotan camp and getting the buildings built and such.
When you type in, Wet'suwet'en into Twitter, you're going to get like Wet'suwet'en Strong, Wet'suwet'en Solidarity. You just poke around a little bit on any of those hashtags, and you're going to see the hashtag Shut Canada Down. And the Shut Canada Down hashtag and that whole program is driven by these people. It's going down.
Yes, they're a website that allows anarchists to post anonymously of their actions that they take. So over the years, It's Going Down is published just the reports of the anarchists who have tampered with train lines or who got involved in police fights or got involved in different protests. But it's mainly very, very subversive, very destructive protests, illegal protests. And It's Going Down is the tool that the anarchist activists are using to promote their illegal activities under a mask, so no one will know who's writing the articles.
Donald Trump calls us thugs. Democrats complain that they can't control us. What are they afraid of? Anarchists oppose all forms of oppressive power. We strive for a world based on self-determination and mutual aid. As the world veers towards tyranny, only grassroots direct action can keep our communities safe. If you're ready to take action without waiting for orders, you're one of us. If you want to learn more about us, visit these websites.
The man whose voice was in that video, his name was Franklin Lopez. Franklin Lopez, he comes from a family. His father was a revolutionary in the Caribbean. He later worked for Democracy Now! In the U.S. as a producer. And then he came up to Canada and started making these anarchist videos of "It's us and we'll smash the state and we'll burn down police cars." And every time people in black masks smash something up, he does a video on it. The interesting thing about Franklin Lopez is that he was hired by Al Jazeera to do a documentary up at the Wet'suwet'en protest and to do a documentary on the East Coast in New Brunswick at the Micmac protests against the natural gas there. So he's an interesting fellow in that he's writing video or doing videos encouraging people to be burning down cop cars, but he's literally funded by a Qatari state-run TV station, Al Jazeera, who are funding him to do these videos encouraging people to get into fights with the police at the Wasutan protests.
Let's focus on the people that run this country. They expect all of Canada, the rest of non-Aboriginal Canadians, right, to have absolutely no say. This is one of those issues where immigration you can't talk about or you're a racist, right? You can't talk about First Nations issues or you're a racist, period. So, we have people who think that a 30-year-old white dude, right, has to pay for what his ancestors did 80 years ago. What the hell? There's no way that that's the world that we should be living in. But that is what so many people believe. And I mean, I just had a conversation with a friend of 30 years yesterday. We hadn't talked in years. And he's got a very active business going on, helping First Nations with business development and so forth. More power to him. But when listening to him, and he's talking about how public, is a very good thing, that public opinion in Canada is almost there. They almost fully believe that every single white person that's living today is responsible for the injustice to natives. And that's just insane. And, let me just take this as a moment to bring this up, right? I may be white and I rue the race baiters that make me have to do this. But I'm not white. I'm a card-carrying Aboriginal Canadian. I'm Métis. This is my Métis Nation of BC card. And Vancouver Métis Citizen Society. I'm an Indian, right? But I'm white. So take that. My blood's red, and I'll tell you it's red. So, we got to have a discussion in Canada that just goes well beyond where we're stuck with. And our politicians, until they allow Canadians to have a discussion in safety, I'm very worried about how we're gonna end this, because sooner or later, the succession movement that is being supported by anarchists from the U.S. and around the world who want to see the destruction of Western civilization, we're just going to get eaten up, right? The regular Canadians.
They don't really talk about what they want to build afterwards. They say they want to build some cooperative, blah, 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 but I don't really hear very many solutions from people. This is one of my experiences. I lived in East Europe after the wall fell. And I saw the results of what happened with revolution and evolution. This is a big discussion we had at Occupy. What do we need? Revolution, tear it all apart? Or evolution? Maybe we get a little bit better, right? Revolution is a very dangerous thing. What these people want to have is, when revolution comes, and I've watched it happen, I've lived through the after effects, it's the poor people and the old people and the weak who are going to suffer most. And these are the people that these activists say that they're supporting.
Yeah, Greg, I mean, that's so critically important. I mean, I'd like to add to that, just as an addendum, is that the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. And so they never actually get to the end, because it's just from one issue to the next. And, sober-minded people look at it and go, well, didn't we fix that issue? And then there's the next issue, and then the next issue, and then issues layered upon issues. That's because it's never about the issue, right? The issue's the revolution, dummy. Don't you get it, right? As long as we're fighting for radical change, we're A-okay. That path that you see, how responsible do you think that really is? That traffic coming from the U.S. into Canada. We've talked a lot about the ideology. I want to finish just a little bit more on the money. How much of an issue is that?
I think the sheer volume of money coming in is quite an issue. Is a question I like to ask Canadians quite often is, who is the richest country on earth? And the answer I like to give people is possibly Canada. Right? We have this small population of 30 so many million people, and the second largest landmass on earth. We have oil, and we have gold mines, and we have copper, and we have trees, and we have salmon, and we have, you name it, all these resources. And all these outside organizations from other countries are trying to influence what we do with it. And I don't think most Canadians realize what's happening. Well, I know they don't. But all this outside influence on top of the fact that Canadians aren't that engaged with our politics and what's going on with this it's leading us to being influenced to make decisions against ourselves, right? To fight against pipelines. To fight against Canadian pipelines while saying nothing about pipelines in Russia or Saudi or Nigeria, the ones leaking oil everywhere. I think this money has created it's kind of warped our politics internally. It's kind of, in some cases, directed us to be almost self-hating.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful comment, self-hating.
When you look at the decolonization, that in a way is that, is it not? I mean, Canadians are so angry at themselves for what's happened in the past for First Nations, as we should be. But we should be, angry about the fact that there are First Nations that don't have clean water. Absolutely. But all that anger is being taken and is being mixed up into other issues. If everyone was protesting for First Nations people to all have fresh water, instead of to not be able to make a living for the Wet'suwet'en people who are going to get jobs out of this, we're actually protesting for them to stay in poverty.